So welcome to module number 2 of our SISAS course. We're going to be talking about in this module, we have 4 different lessons. We're going to be talking about Cisco ISE fundamentals. And in this module, we're going to describe the key characteristics of ISE, like what are the different components of ISE and how do they interact with each other, and what are those components, how are those components utilized to provide all the services that ISE provides. How are we going to enroll Cisco ISE in what we call the public key infrastructure environment? How do we implement Cisco ISE internal authentication? And then we'll take a look at integrating external authentication in ISE as well. So this particular platform, obviously, we know what it does. It's going to enable us to provide our infrastructure security. It's going to allow us to define ubiquitous policies and assessments that we can apply to our organization for comprehensive security and access control, and then also gather real-time contextual information about the devices that are connecting to the network itself, and even the users that are accessing the network as well. So we'll have 4 lessons in this particular module. Let's go ahead and start off in lesson number 1, which is the Cisco ISE overview. All right. In this lesson, we're going to talk about what are the different ISE technologies. In other words, what kind of processes or functions does ISE provide, and then we'll talk about how those functions integrate together to provide us really robust security assessment and management platform. We'll take a look at ISE's policy engine and how we define different policies within the ISE environment. We'll take a look at the basic high-level flow of Cisco ISE, and talk about how it processes data through the platform, making assessments on individual components that are connecting to the network and so on. We'll take a look at different ISE nodes. What are the different nodes? What are the different personas? And what are the different roles of each of these personas in the environment? And then finally, we'll talk about different ISE deployment scenarios where we actually implement ISE in a couple of different areas, a couple of different ways. So we're going to take a look at several different aspects of Cisco ISE, and we'll take a look at all of the different services that that it provides, and really just kind of all of the functions that Cisco ISE provides in our environment. All right, let's get started. All right, so we're looking at, in this particular slide here, an example of all of the features and the functions that ISE provides from the perspective of guest access, device profiling, posture assessments, MAC security or MACsec encryption, security group access, which is the Cisco TrustSec environment, and also identity-based firewall features. We know that the Cisco Secure Access Solution, which is what ISE provides us different authentication and authorization components. 802.1x, we talked about that yesterday quite extensively. MAC authentication bypass, and then finally WebAuth. And then we also talk about those are some of the authentication components, but we also have different authorization pieces, right? Once you've been authenticated, what are some of the options that we have for providing some sort of authorization, right? Are we going to apply, in this case, a VLAN to the individual? Are we going to assign a downloadable ACL, some sort of security group configuration using Cisco TrustSec, security group access with security group tags? Are we going to apply some security group ACLs? And then also provide some firewalling features as well. So authorization allows us to identify essentially what the individual is allowed to do once we've authenticated that individual and so on. We have a guest access feature, obviously allowing us to not only profile guest accounts, but also assign guest privileges and identify where those guests are going to be able to connect to. We have a device profiler, primarily used in the case of BYOD, although we can profile corporate assets. We profile devices for the purposes of identifying whether or not they are a Windows machine, a Macintosh, Linux machine, or whatever, Android smart device or an iPhone smart device. So profiling allows us to identify the types of devices that are connecting to our network. Once I've done that profiling, I can then identify the posture of those devices, making sure that the endpoints meet our specific obligations or requirements to connect to the network, identifying, if they have the appropriate tools in place, they have the appropriate anti-malware, anti-spyware kind of definitions. And then we can incorporate, in addition, MACsec. We're going to have a whole lesson describing the concept of MAC-based security, but this allows us to essentially providing a confidentiality, integrity, and availability features from a link-to-link perspective in our layer 2 domain. And that's why we essentially call it MACsec. MAC stands for Media Access Control in this particular case. And then security group access, right? Some sort of scalable way of authorizing users and devices in the network, in a sense that once I apply a policy to a device, that policy is going to continue on through the entire enterprise from device to device to device based on security group tags and the Cisco TrustSec architecture. And then finally, identity-based firewall, right? How can I set my firewall policies based on the identity instead of the IP address? Meaning that we're going to create firewall policies based on authentication, based on authorization, and so on. All right. So endpoint profiling services allow us to dynamically identify the device endpoints. It manages these devices based on predefined security policies that we put into place. This profiling service allows us to identify, manage, and inventory all of the devices on our network that have IP addresses, and then the posture function then verifies endpoint compliance with whatever governing security policy that we've put into place. Provides hop-by-hop encryption, like I said, with MACsec, and then finally security group access establishes what we call a cloud of trust to build security networks instead of relying strictly on stateless information like IP address, application, and so on. So we have lots and lots of tools available, but these are the primary components of Cisco ISE. The key operational components of this access control network, they're going to work together to provide a very comprehensive solution. We talked a lot about the different authentication options that we have with regard to authorizing or authenticating and then authorizing devices to the network. IEEE 802.1x, MAC authentication, bypass, and then WebAuth. We also know that we integrate this solution into a Radius environment, which is built into Cisco ISE that provides us authentication and authorization components, as well as logging and monitoring of those devices. We can also integrate the ISE platform into back-end identity stores like LDAP or Active Directory. And we can provide guest services, posture assessments, profiling, and based on different types of assessments, we can do a change of authorization. All the kind of the pieces that go into building this particular platform, right? We know that we have the supplicant. The supplicant is connecting to our network access device to Cisco ISE, sending over that Radius access request message, and then ISE might consult an internal identity store, or it might consult an external identity source like Microsoft Active Directory or LDAP to do credential verification and to verify the user group attributes. If, for example, we have guests that don't have access, we can provide web authentication, or we can provide some other authentication means to allow those guests to connect to the network. You know, after we've gone through the whole process of verifying the end user, verifying the device, we go through and do a Radius access accept reply from the authentication server, and then we can go on and perform other actions or perform other steps against that particular device to identify, you know, various aspects of that device. Does it meet our specific connectivity requirements? Does it have the right, is it the right kind of device? Does it have the right applications and software and so on? All right. As far as what ISE incorporates. Obviously, we talked about the fact that it includes TACX and Radius, so it incorporates our authentication, authorization, and accounting functions. It has a posture assessment piece. It has a profiling piece. We can provide for device onboarding. We'll talk about in a future lesson how individuals with BYOD in a BYOD environment can actually self-register and onboard their own devices based on assuring that we meet those different security policies. Of course, we have guest management, centralized policy administration, and then centralized monitoring. This is a big piece right here because we want to be able to identify what's happening in the network. How can we audit our devices? How can we provide for historical reporting, real-time reporting, and so on? We know that overall, when it comes to security, our goal is to define a way of authenticating users, a way of authorizing users based on certain criteria, match criteria. And one of the things that we'll learn throughout the rest of this course is how do we set up those policies and how do we take action against that specific match criteria. All right, so we have the ability to discover devices, classify devices, associate the identity of endpoints into a particular environment. So our goal obviously is to be able for us, like I said, for us to be able to discover the devices, to classify devices, to identify the different endpoints, to perform device onboarding, which either will require some sort of web interface that the client is going to go to onboard their device individually, or some sort of thin client that allows us to identify the endpoint itself and find out what kind of software it has and so on. But the idea overall is for us to be able to enforce our security policies, either by blocking, isolating, or repairing any non-compliant machines in some sort of quarantined environment without the need for an administrator getting involved. So this is an automated process. And of course, the ISE platform has a robust set of tools that provide for reporting, troubleshooting, and so on, which allows us to identify issues or just events that are occurring kind of on a regular basis in our environment. All right, so let's take a look at the flow of information, how the data flows through ISE, and kind of what is the process that we go through. And we'll see some more in-depth flow charts that describe these processes a little bit later on. First thing that we see, obviously, is that the device is going to attempt to access. And we're going to do some sort of authentication, either based on 802.1x, MAB, MAC Authentication Bypass, or web authentication. And we may choose to simply go right through the authorization. Once we've authenticated the device, go through some sort of authorization process. That could include a posture assessment of the device, where we will go through and we will send this device into our posture engine to be able to identify what the posture of that device is, if it meets our requirements, if we have to do any kind of remediation. And we'll get an output from that system saying, okay, the device now meets whatever requirements or already meets the requirements that are necessary for our environment. And that will trigger some sort of change of authorization to provide a different level of access for that particular device. We might even go into profiling the device. And the profiler, based on the device, might require some secondary authentication. So there's a cycle here that might repeat, right, based on the profile of the device, what type of device it is. And we can also make use of any kind of change of authorization here as well, based on the type of device. And then finally, once the device has been authorized, we give the device access to whatever resources it needs access to. All right. Now, the authentication piece, like I said, can come from 3 different ways: 802.1x, MAB, or WebAuth. And then, like I said, based on the characteristics of that authentication process, we have an authorization policy that selects how we're going to communicate to the network access device, and then basically how we're going to control the endpoint from that point forward. If we do have posturing services deployed, authorization profile based on the authentication credentials will identify that the device needs to go through some sort of posture assessment and potentially remediation. Once that posture assessment begins, the endpoint is either determined as being compliant or non-compliant, and we may be able to offer some sort of change of authorization based on the state change of that particular device. Profiling services, like I said, basically allows us to identify what type of device this is connecting, and allows us to kind of identify the individual component that's connecting to the network. And then finally, the results of both of these scenarios allow us to identify whether or not the device has some sort of classification that allows it to connect to the network and then access network resources. One of the things that you guys are going to definitely have to be familiar with the Cisco ISE platform is how to identify the different personas and how these different personas are deployed in the ISE environment. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the different ISE personas. And some of these individual personas can be combined together. Some of them can reside separately on a platform. But when you're running ISE, ISE can run as an appliance, a separate physical appliance in your network, or it can run as a virtual machine in your network. We can basically ensure that that particular device is operating in essentially 3 different personas, right? It could be distributed across multiple nodes, these services, or they can be deployed on a single node. But there are 3 primary personas that exist: the administration persona, the policy services persona, and the monitoring persona. Okay? The administration persona, that's essentially your control center for the Cisco ISE deployment. Licensing, user interface, pushing configurations out to different nodes, distributing configurations to different ISE nodes in a distributed deployment, and then also all of the administrative tools that you would expect to see with a particular ISE platform. That's our administration persona. Policy services persona, as the name suggests, is basically the persona that provides all of the services for our policy decisions, right? It's the runtime engine that processes all the messages that pertain to implementing this ISE deployment. DHCP, Cisco Discovery Protocol, Radius, NetFlow, TACX, and so on. The policy service persona is basically what we call a PSN. You'll see that referenced in the book quite a bit, the PSN, Policy Services Node. Administration will call that an admin node, but the PSN is one that you see quite a bit, and that's basically any ISE platform that's running this policy services persona. Then we have our monitoring persona, which obviously is pretty straightforward. This is our monitoring node that's going to be able to generate reports and alarms and give us the ability to monitor everything that's happening in our ISE environment. Like I said, you don't have to deploy all of these components individually on separate ISE nodes. You could run a standalone node where you decide to run all 3 personas within that node, or you could distribute those services across multiple nodes. This is going to be your workhorse right here. The PSN is really the one that's going to be doing all of the authentication and authorization and profiling, posture assessments, and so on. So that's a really, really important component in the network. Admin persona generally and the monitoring piece are usually combined together, but you can offload some of those resources in a distributed environment as well. I don't know, Andy, you guys run a single node, a standalone node, or are you guys running a distributed environment?
Distributed. We have a primary and secondary. One that and the secondary it is basically all of the PSN stuff.
Right. I mean, yeah, and that's really what we tend to separate typically in most deployment scenarios. The PSN is going to be separate from the admin component and from the monitoring component, because that's really the server or the node that's going to be processing all of the transactions. So this was a short little lesson. We talked about basically all of the services that the ISE platform provides: posture, profiling, guest management, and so on. Centralized policy administration, centralized monitoring, the different personas, administration, policy services or PSN, and the monitoring node, and then how Cisco ISE can be deployed in a redundant fashion, active-active scenario or an active failover scenario, and then also provides the ability to offload services onto different nodes in the network, depending on how many devices that you're managing and so on. So that is the end of that lesson. What we're going to do next is we're going to take a look at lesson number 2, which is the Cisco ISE public key infrastructure. And we're going to take a look at X.509 certificates, how we install an ISE certificate, how we identify the ISE signature, enrolling ISE into this public key infrastructure environment, looking at Cisco, looking at the way of doing maybe a signing request or managing certificates in the ISE platform. So we'll see you guys there in a little bit.